Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events. This week I sit down with Anthony Norfolk, board president of the Roedde House Museum in Vancouver, Canada. During our conversation, Anthony talks about the history of Vancouver, the lives of early pioneers as seen through the home of the city's first bookbinder, Gustav Roedde, and the day-to-day life of individuals at the end of the 1800s. First of all, thank you for taking the time to come on the show, and welcome to The Exchange.
Well, it's always fun doing these. Yeah.
I appreciate it. Would love to maybe start the conversation by learning a little bit about your interest in history and specifically the history of Vancouver. We're sitting in Vancouver in this old Victorian home. How did you get involved in the museum and into the history of Vancouver? Is that something you've been involved with for quite some time or sometime rather recently?
Well, I rolled up in Vancouver in 1986. One of the first people I met was the woman who was really the driving force behind the establishment of this museum. Her name was Janet Bingham. So she drew me in. And that's how it started. So I've been involved sort of peripherally since about 1986. But more and more she drew me in, and so I ended up as the board chair.
Cool. And was it the period of time specifically of the late 19th century that was particularly interesting to you, or just preserving general history was more what kind of drew you into the museum itself?
Well, I've always been always been interested in history, and the amount of the amount of history in Vancouver is relatively short in terms of time. It's only just over 100 years since Vancouver was founded, and this the houses that survive in the West End of Vancouver are only a little younger than the city. So you work with what you have. It really doesn't bother me that it's a relatively short time compared to some other places, because what Janet and her pioneers put together here is a really interesting place.
And the family that lived in this particular house is the Roedde family. I believe Gustav was the patriarch of the family, the original inhabitant. Is that right?
That's correct, with his wife Matilda.
So the people that were drawn to Vancouver, as you said, Vancouver is a very young town. Who were the sorts of characters that were drawn to Vancouver? Why would anyone back in the 19th century move here? What was the appeal?
Vancouver had several things going for it. One was the railway that was put in coast to coast as part of the deal for creating Canada. And of course, the natural resource business was an underpinning for the economy and for the railway. So Vancouver has always been a resource town, a port town, and is essentially the commercial centre of the two joined colonies that became British Columbia. So starting at that in the late 1800s, there was very little here except a bunch of, in the case of the West End where we are now, a bunch of stumps, but close to where there was economic activity.
Right.
And the West End was surveyed, and lots were created, and people bought lots and built houses.
And the Roedde family specifically, do we know much about what interested them specifically in Vancouver? I believe, as we were talking earlier, they were of European descent. So what was the story of why they were specifically interested in Vancouver?
Well, they actually started off in North America. They started off in Cleveland, which is where they met. when they got married, they went to San Francisco for a short while, and then were attracted up to Victoria, which at that time was the big town in a newly created British Columbia, comparatively. But that was the point where Vancouver overtook Victoria, or was in the process of overtaking Victoria. And so they came here to establish the kind of business that Gustav was trained in.
And the people at that time that were moving into Vancouver, was the government open to virtually any people of any ethnicity coming and immigrating at that time into British Columbia, or was it more specified? Were there quotas? Were there only certain people of certain descent that were allowed to come?
I think it's the other way around. It's more the question of people of certain descent that were not allowed to come, or not supposed to come, or only allowed to come because they were workers on specific things, like Chinese working on the railroads and that kind of stuff. So there was a form of selectivity, but no disinterested people like Gustav and Matilda who were coming here with families. They had small family already started by then, coming in here to establish businesses. He provided a service that. While there were other printers, he very quickly became the preeminent printer, bookbinder. He was an expert in marbling, which is the particular distinctive style of decorating papers for the use in books. And even Mounted View Cemetery today has ledgers with Roedde printers label on the inside of the cover. So he became the preeminent guy in that field.
So it sounds like people who were Western European were generally welcome to immigrate, but like you mentioned, Chinese and potentially other races were really only allowed to come in to work on individual specified projects. And then did they have to leave after that? Is that?
I can't say that they had to leave. They were here, and their descendants still are in among the Chinese community and that kind of thing. There were some of the impediments were more a question of having to pay fees. So it was a pretty fluid situation.
We were talking before the interview a little bit about how different things were then and how similar things are now to then. What in your mind, take us through a day in the life of Gustav Roedde and what was an average day like, say a weekday where he was at work? What are some of the things that we would recognize today as being very similar to the way that modern people live, but what are the other things that we would probably find quite drastically different?
Well, regular office hours, for instance. Like a lot of people, he was obviously something of a workaholic. This is where it's different. He used to bring his staff home for lunch, sometimes, and Matilda would feed them. But then they had to get back to work, So that would seldom happen now. The running the house, of course, would be Matilda's business. If you look at the kitchen, you won't find a lot of storage. There are open shelves with pots and pans on them and that kind of stuff. But she would have done her shopping daily. And of course, there would have been deliveries too, much more than now. But she was constantly in movement, making everything from scratch. They did at one point have someone living in, but most of the time they didn't have a living in staff. They had people in from the town to do specific things. We were talking about dishwashers. Oh, no, 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 no. You'll find various patent labor-saving devices that we have in the kitchen from that period. Initially, they didn't have electricity. We have one surviving gaslight fixture. They did not initially have running water in the house. They would have to pump out outside. The bathroom as we have it now was only installed in the 1920s. And it's the same bathroom that was installed in the 1920s, and we're using it still. But there was a lot of evolutionary process going on in the way in which houses ran.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned that he was a bit of a workaholic. What sort of hours would he generally work in a given week to support his career and his family?
I don't know what hours he worked. We have a fair amount of information from his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, particularly a couple of grandchildren who lived here during the First World War while their father was overseas. And they've given us a fair amount of information about daily life and that kind of thing. But he was a man in constant motion. We know that. So, in a business that is dependent on work coming to you, he and his employees would have been spent the hours it took to do the work. The one thing he was not a supporter of was trade unions. So it was very entrepreneurial. He used to go to work he used to go into the office on Sundays. Don't know what he was doing on Sundays, but probably administrative work or something like that. And then he would roll up on a Sunday later on Sunday in the summer when the family wanted to go on a picnic. And they were all sitting here packed up to go to the picnic, and they had to wait for Gustav to turn up in his he was an early car owner. Yeah. And then they could go off to a picnic.
And that sort of work ethic, is that something that you think was common to that era and is not maybe altogether been lost in modern times, but it is significantly has been reduced given the luxuries that we currently live with?
I suspect that there are probably plenty of people around with the same level of drive and involvement in what they're doing. I doubt that that's changed. People seem to, in theory, to have more leisure time now. The 5-day week is much more common, but inevitably you'll find, particularly where entrepreneurs are concerned, they put in the hours that they feel are necessary, and he was an example of that.
And with his career, with a relatively successful business, what sort of an income was he generally bringing in every year? Maybe in those times and in modern.
Can't answer that one. I just don't know. And how the heck you compare, I don't know. I mean, people make these calculations, but they were obviously in comfortable economic circumstances from pretty well the moment he started the business, because they built this place within a couple of years of their arrival. And it's obviously it's not an impressive house in terms of size and that kind of thing. I mean, the ones next door are double-fronted. This is not double-fronted. They're smaller. This is smaller. But you look at the interior fittings, the woodwork, the wainscoting, all that kind of thing, which, you see, he had the advantage of knowing an architect called Rattenbury, who went on to build magnificent, impressive buildings. And Rattenbury seems to have taken a pretty basic design and modified it, particularly with the interior woodwork and the turret on the side that is a hallmark of Rattenbury, and turned yes, a relatively modest house into something really a little bit of a jewel.
Mm-hmm.
It's they were obviously very comfortable. Ultimately, even though they had a lot of people, their family grew up in a small house. They did eventually sell this and move into what is these days a very grand area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they had a summer place out near one of the ferry terminals. As it is now, didn't have a ferry terminal then. But they had the summer place out there and a boat, and the sons were involved in the Royal Vancouver Yacht Club. And in fact, we recently had a display that we shared with the Royal Vancouver Yacht Club of the son Bill Roedde's involvement in design of two classes of sailboat.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do all that kind of stuff if you're scraping your money together.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the restoration and upkeep of the museum, from the perspective of the people that run the museum and keep it up to date and work here, what are the primary goals that you have in maintaining a relic like this for the general public? What are the main drivers of the energy and the passion of the people that work here to do that?
Sharing the information about how people lived at that period of time. The school curriculum that we have was developed by a great-granddaughter who happens to have been a professional curriculum developer. And we revise it periodically with, she revise it periodically. And we also get a real charge from the visitors who come through and really are impressed with with the sense of how it would have been, and enjoy that. And it's got nothing to do with whether or not it's 100 years old or 200 years old or 300 years old. That is irrelevant. We enjoy. Everyone's got a different angle, but we enjoy the process of contributing as best we individually can. The building is owned by the city. We operate it under a contract with the city. They keep the roof on. We have to raise the operating expenses and all that kind of stuff. It's very satisfying when people from all over the place express how they enjoy the experience. And we also enjoy the fact that quite a lot of locals are supportive of acquiring artifacts that fit. Work with us on doing rotating exhibits. I really enjoy those rotating exhibits, which are developed in a very professional style. It is very enjoyable to be a part of the process of presenting.
And presenting that to the public and getting their imaginations going as to what life was like then. Paint a picture for people generally in terms of what that would look like. We were talking a bit earlier about a day in the life. Would people be struck by the clothing that was worn then, the pace of the life at that time, the food that was eaten? What fascinates you about information you've learned in terms of what Gustav's life would have been like on a day-to-day basis, or his family would have been like back then?
Oh, where to start? I'm looking at a display cabinet full of Roedde-related artifacts and photographs and things like that. And it's very difficult to pick one out. We've got photographs of Gustav in his plant, in his workplace, and seeing what a printing shop looked like compared to a printing shop now. Very different. We've got examples of his marbling. We've even had marbling sessions here. And it's absorbing to watch the process. And we've got so many examples of beautiful stuff he's done. He would assemble sheet music and bind it in leather with gold lettering and all that kind of stuff. And we've got examples here. I mean, that leads to the presentation of the 2 concert series that we have, because he was obsessed with opera himself. We have both wax. Well, they're not wax actually. It's a different material, but they're called wax cylinders, and record players here, just reflecting the fact that the family was extremely musical. They used to have parlor concerts. They didn't have television. They entertained themselves. We have a classical series and a jazz series. There was the jazz age. We have a limited number of people. It's just people sitting around in the parlor. That's fun. I can go on like that. I mean, there are so many of the things that we can do here that are fun, informative, and as valid now as they were then.
It was the culture then, let's say in 1893 or maybe a few years later, that before the turn of the century, was the culture that was being created here in Vancouver, was it similar to the Victorian era in England in terms of its general cultural values, or was there something new going on? Was there a new sort of spirit or culture that was being found in this new city?
I think what was being found here, you would probably find in a lot of American cities at the same time. We had an opera house. Vaudeville was big stuff. We have a number of surviving theatres that were built as vaudeville theatres. Vancouver was on the North American circuit for cultural, if I can put it that way, touring groups and individuals. We were part of the circuit, I mean, people would come to North America, but they'd include Canadian cities. So in that respect, we were pretty close.
And what would, in terms of just the maybe the more shocking features of the differences of what a day in the life was like then, right? I mean, people were socializing, coming over for music. People were reading books. Like you said, there was no television. Are there elements to that culture that would, you think, be particularly shocking to people today? Is it the lack of just modern medical care? If you got sick, the odds of you getting an infection and dying, the lack of anesthesia. What do you think this family particularly may have experienced that it would be difficult for modern Americans or Canadians to really understand or relate to because we never have had to do so?
Well, you mentioned the medical side of things. There was no Medicare or anything of that nature. That big house that is next door to us was it's the proprietor's second private hospital. He had one up the street. Then he bought that, turned it into a bigger private hospital, and the previous building he had became the nurses' quarters. So, if you didn't have money, problem. The other thing that probably would have distinguished Vancouver from some places is that it probably was a pretty wild place. When the loggers came into town, we have a street, Granville Street, which has 30. It still has 13 of the old, somewhat specialized hotels that were built by one particular firm of architects to look after the loggers and miners who came into town in the hopes of separating them from their money, of which they had a lot when they came to town, quite quickly in the pub downstairs. So there were sometimes weekend evenings on Granville Street can be a little noisy these days, but I think it's a little tame compared to the way it was.
Were primarily those people, the loggers and the miners, was it mostly single young men who would come into town, like you said, with some money, ready to basically party? Yeah.
That's it. How young was young in those days? They were probably, yes, we would call them young, because they probably didn't last as long as they would now. With life expectancy, of course, significantly longer.
What was the religion of the time in the city? Was it Anglican? Was it just a hodgepodge of combinations of various Protestant faiths and Catholicism? What was at that time in the turn of the century, back in the late 1800s? What sort of religion was being practiced here?
I think you put it correctly. It was everything. Of course, it was somewhat compartmentalized in terms of people associating with people of their own religion, and people from one religion perhaps being more associated with particular ethnic groups and things like this. The big hospital, two big hospitals, but the one closest to here was the Sisters, St. Paul's Hospital, was a Catholic hospital, still is technically. Two major hospitals like that, one of which was run by the nuns. Pretty well at one point, not that far again, almost next to St. Paul's, you have a really impressive, what is now called the United Church, that is on one corner, and directly across the street is a Baptist church of the same level of solidity and stone and all that kind of stuff. And they're across the street from each other.
Right.
So you've got everything. But we even have, even from that period, not so much in Vancouver, but in the Lower Mainland, they've had Sikh temples. The Sikhs have been involved in the logging industry since the early days. All those relatively smaller groups had their religious. It was very tolerant.
Last question I want to ask you is about the difference between Vancouver then versus Vancouver today. As you were just mentioning, that with all the different religions, Vancouver still has that reputation of being a multicultural, tolerant city. What are the similarities that have held true from the late 1800s to now that are similar in character regarding Vancouver now versus roughly 100 years ago, and how has it changed significantly in your view?
Vancouver has changed even since I've lived here. When I arrived in 1986, it's larger, it's more cosmopolitan. It is more tolerant than it was. I mean, there were nasty incidents in the past of ships being turned away with horrendous consequences.
Commercial ships, or?
No, I mean, ships bringing, refugees. There are a lot of people who would rather not talk about some of those things. There's, during the Second World War, there was the internment of the Japanese, which, a lot of people are now ashamed about. But I remember talking to a former member of Parliament who himself recalls the fears of the general population during the Second World War, that the Japanese would invade and they would have submarines off the harbour and this kind of stuff. He didn't agree with that kind of paranoia, but he said it was very real. So that was from someone who was here at the time and remembers it. So sometimes these things can swing wildly. But in general terms, I would say that it is extremely tolerant, multicultural, slightly out-of-date term these days, but accepting, enjoying differences.
Well, Anthony, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Very welcome.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about the Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com.